The rains had not yet touched the dust that choked the Wyoming Valley when Callum Hart rode into Hollow Bend. His horse was limping, a shot wound still oozing dark against the animal's flank. Behind him, the horizon split open with a cold wind, but there was no one coming after him now. He had buried the last of them 2 counties back, men whose faces he would not bother remembering. The town smelled of mold and cheap spirits, its streets narrow, crooked, and scattered with stray dogs and slower men. Callum dismounted stiffly, his bones protesting the movement. He was 36 and bore the scars of a man twice that. He tied the reins to a hitching post that leaned sideways and crossed the street toward the saloon without a glance at the blacksmith watching him from under the eaves. Inside, the air was thick with sweat and pipe smoke. Callum moved through it like a blade through water. He was not a man who needed to announce himself. His silence was a hard shape others gave way to. At a battered table near the back, his target sat, hat pulled low, a bottle sweating between his hands. But as Callum drew closer, he realized it was not the man he sought, not anymore. It was his widow. A slip of a woman, no more than 22, with hollow cheeks and a guarded tilt to her chin. She lifted her eyes to meet his, and in that moment Callum saw the thing that gave him pause. She was not broken, not yet. "Your heart," she said. It was not a question. "And you're Caroline Mason." His voice was low, used to being obeyed. She nodded once tightly and pushed the bottle toward him. "You're late." He sat down across from her. The chair creaked under his weight. He studied her hands, small, calloused, the nails broken short. She wore a faded blue dress, the hem stitched over too many times to count. Survival clung to her like a second skin. "I need a wife," Callum said. The words lay between them like a pistol on the table. Caroline did not flinch, "and I need a way out of Hollow Bend." A slow nod from him. He had seen the way the men watched her when she fetched water from the well or carried bread from the bakery. She would not last long here alone. "I won't lie with you," she said, voice sharp. "Not unless I choose to." "Not asking you to," Callum said. His hands stayed flat on the table. "I offer you a name, protection, a place to live that ain't this cesspool." She lifted her chin higher. "And what do you get?" He leaned back, letting the chair tip onto 2 legs. "I get a wife folk won't look twice at, a woman to keep the house from falling in on itself, maybe a quiet life for once." He watched her closely. "And maybe a son." Her mouth tightened. She had no illusions about how women were valued, but she also saw something else there. Callum Hart did not wear his grief like a badge. He wore it like a hidden wound, stitched tight and festering. Caroline weighed her choices. Die here or die later, with a man's name shielding her from the worst of it. Or maybe, just maybe, carve something better from the ruin. "I'll do it," she said, "on my terms." He nodded once, businesslike. They married the next morning under the cracked steeple of the town's lopsided church, the preacher smelling of stale whiskey, words slurring over the vows. Caroline wore a plain gray shawl, her hair pinned back in a severe knot. Callum placed a heavy silver ring on her finger, a thing too large for her narrow hand, and she curled her fingers around it like a secret. No kiss, no promises. Afterward, they rode out of Hollow Bend together, 2 strangers lashed together by necessity. The valley swallowed them up, and the town forgot them before the dust from their passing even settled. Their destination was a stretch of land called Bitter Hollow, 6 miles beyond the last gasping fence post of civilization. A place abandoned after the sickness came through 5 winters back, leaving houses empty and fields gone to rot. Callum had bought the deed for a handful of gold and the promise of never coming back. The house was more ruin than shelter. Shutters hung loose. The roof sagged in places. The front porch creaked under the weight of a single step. Caroline climbed down from the horse and surveyed it with grim practicality. "It'll do," she said. Callum led the horse to the barn, or what was left of it, and set to work without another word. They moved around each other like wary animals, not yet trusting, not yet sure whether to fight or flee. At night, the wind sang through the broken slats of the walls, and Caroline slept curled up in the corner of the bedroom, knife tucked into the folds of her skirt. Callum slept by the door, rifle within easy reach. Neither spoke of why they did not share a bed. In the cold dawn, she found him mending a fence post, blood crusted on his knuckles where the hammer had slipped. You had a family once, she said, not a question. He looked up, face unreadable. I did, he said, a long time ago. She waited, but no more words came. Caroline turned back toward the house, the ache of loneliness pressing into her chest, sharper than she expected. She had thought she would be invisible to him, a fixture to be tolerated. She had not counted on the silence between them being heavier than a blow. They lived like that through winter, carving survival out of frostbit mornings and meager harvests. She planted what seeds she could find, he hunted, they built shelves, repaired the well pump, patched the roof with scrap wood. Slowly the house grew less skeletal. It breathed again, stubborn and creaking but alive. And somewhere between the hammer strikes and the soft rustle of Caroline's skirts as she moved through the kitchen, something else took root, silent and stubborn. A kind of hope neither dared name yet. The past was not dead. It slept beneath their feet like old bones, waiting for the right storm to unearth it. And storms always came. Spring bled into Bitter Hollow with little grace. The creek that ran crooked behind the house swelled with mud and broken branches. Callum dug trenches to keep the flood from reaching the foundations, his shoulders bowed under the cold weight of the rain. Caroline worked beside him, sleeves rolled to her elbows, mud sucking at her boots. Neither spoke unless necessary. The work shaped their hours and left them too tired for anything else. But there was a rhythm to it, a trust that grew like moss in the cracks. He handed her nails without being asked. She braced the ladder before he climbed. One morning, as mist still clung to the fields, Callum returned from a hunt dragging a carcass behind him, a doe, clean shot through the heart. Caroline met him at the barn, a worn canvas apron already tied around her waist. They butchered the animal side by side, their hands slick with blood, the steaming guts attracting clouds of flies. "You shoot good," she said, slicing through tendon with a practiced hand. He grunted, "Was a time I didn't miss." She glanced up, curious. "Before or after the family you lost?" He wiped his blade clean against the grass, staring past her toward the horizon. "Before," he said, "when I thought it mattered." Caroline said nothing. There was no kindness that wouldn't turn to pity on her tongue, and Callum Hart was a man who would sooner bite off his own hand than be pitied. Instead, she worked in silence, honoring the weight of what was unsaid. By the first real thaw, Caroline began to show. It came quietly, a skipped bleeding here, a strange fluttering sickness in the mornings. She said nothing at first, unwilling to name the thing growing inside her for fear it might wither under the coldness that still lingered between them. But Callum noticed. He noticed when she pushed the plate away at supper, face pale, when her hands trembled hanging laundry, when she no longer slept but lay curled on her side, one hand pressed protectively against her belly. He said nothing until the night he found her outside, kneeling in the mud, retching so hard she gasped for air. He hauled her up without ceremony, carried her back inside despite her weak protests, laid her down by the fire and wrapped every blanket they owned around her shivering body. "You should have told me," he said, voice rough as gravel. "I didn't know how," she whispered. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. For the first time, Callum knelt before her, not as a husband by law, but as something closer to a supplicant. "You're carrying my blood," he said. "You ain't alone, Caroline, not anymore." Something fragile and fierce sparked behind her tired eyes, a thing neither of them could afford to smother. From that day he tended to her without needing to be asked, built a rocking chair with his own rough hands, the joints uneven but sturdy, strung extra traps to ensure more food, rode half a day to fetch peppermint and ginger root to ease her sickness. He never touched her without permission, never demanded the wifely duties men thought they were owed. He offered only what he could, protection, labor, his unspoken loyalty. She began to lean on him, piece by piece. In the mornings, she sat at the window with her sewing and watched him split wood. When he passed, he would catch her small smile hidden behind her hand. At night, they played at pretending. She would read aloud from a battered Bible, not for prayer, but for the cadence of another voice filling the hollow rooms. He would smoke his pipe and listen, eyes closed, as if memorizing the sound of her. Time softened the edges of their solitude, but the world beyond Bitter Hollow had not forgotten them. Word traveled slower than men, but travel it did. A stranger rode up the path one dusk, face hidden under a wide-brimmed hat, horse restless beneath him. Callum answered the knock with a rifle balanced loose, but ready in his arms. The stranger spoke first, looking for Caroline Mason. Callum said nothing, only the tightening of his jaw betrayed him. Caroline stepped into view, one hand resting on the gentle curve of her stomach. Her mouth set hard when she recognized the man. "Hello, cousin," she said. The man smiled thinly, revealing yellowed teeth. "Heard you found yourself a husband. Thought I'd come collect what's owed to the family." Caroline's hand tightened in her skirts. "She owes nothing," Callum said. The cousin laughed, mean and sharp. "You think marrying her wipes her father's debts? That bastard owed me $50 when he died, and the girl's worth twice that on her back." Callum stepped onto the porch, the boards groaning under his boots. "Leave," he said. The cousin spat in the dirt. "This ain't your quarrel, Hart. You don't know what you bought." Without another word, Callum raised the rifle and fired. The bullet struck the ground inches from the horse's hooves. The animal reared, nearly throwing the man. Cursing, the cousin wheeled around and galloped off into the failing light. Caroline stood frozen, breath coming in sharp gasps. Callum lowered the rifle, turned to her. "You don't owe nobody nothing," he said. "Not anymore." She nodded once fiercely. Then, without warning, she stepped into him, her head against his chest. He stood still, letting her heartbeat hammer against his ribs, letting her draw strength without words. His hand came up slowly, awkwardly, and rested against her back. For the first time she wept, not from fear, not from shame, but from the terrible relief of being safe, truly safe, for the first time in her memory. That night she climbed into his bed, not because she had to, but because she chose to. And in the fragile darkness, the distance between them dissolved, replaced by something raw and unfinished and achingly real. Bitter hollow held its breath around them, and the walls did not fall. They had built something that even the past could not tear down so easily. But storms, true storms, always find their way back. And theirs was still gathering. The summer that followed was cruel. Heat clung to the valley like a fever, and the air grew thick with biting flies and the smell of things gone sour. Caroline moved slower now, her body heavy with the child. She did not complain. Complaint was a luxury Bitter Hollow never offered. Instead, she tied a damp cloth around her neck and moved through the days with grim purpose, her hands never idle. Callum built her a cradle from stripped pine, carving each joint with the same care he once gave to loading a rifle. He did not say much about it, only worked until his fingers split and bled. Caroline watched him from the porch, sewing tiny shirts from what little cloth they had, her needle flashing in the dying light. They never spoke of what would happen if the birth went wrong. Some things were better left unspoken. It was August when trouble found them again. The cousin did not come alone this time. 3 men rode into Bitter Hollow under a sky as pale as bone. Dust clouded their faces, their horses mean and ill-fed. They brought no greetings, no warnings. Callum saw them first from the fields. He dropped his shovel and crossed the yard at a run, calling for Caroline. She met him at the door, breath catching when she saw the grim line of his mouth. "Inside," he said. She obeyed without argument. Callum stood alone on the porch, the rifle loose in his hands, his stance wide and ready. The men reined up a few yards away, their leader, her cousin, grinning like a skull. "You didn't listen, Hart," he called. "You had your warning." Callum said nothing. Words were wasted on men who only heard what they wanted. "You give us the girl," the cousin continued, "or we take her and everything else you got." A crow called from the treetops, sharp and ugly. Callum raised the rifle. The first shot rang out like a crack of lightning. The man to the left jerked backward, a hole blooming in his chest. Chaos exploded. The cousin drew his pistol, firing wildly. The third man spurred his horse forward, charging the porch. Callum moved with brutal precision. Another shot, another man down. The last, the cousin spurred his horse into a reckless gallop toward the barn, trying to flank him. Caroline, watching through the cracked window, made a choice. She grabbed Callum's second rifle from its place above the hearth, her hands steady despite the tremor in her legs. She shoved open the door and stepped outside. The cousin saw her, his face twisted in triumph. "Got you now, girl," he shouted. Caroline raised the rifle, her belly heavy, her heart steady. The shot she fired was not perfect. It caught the cousin high in the shoulder, spinning him from the saddle. He hit the ground hard, screaming. Callum reached him first, dragged the man up by the collar, slammed him against the barn wall so hard the boards rattled. "You come to my land," Callum growled. "You threaten my wife, my blood." He pressed the barrel of his gun against the cousin's forehead. "You don't walk away from that." Caroline stepped closer, the rifle hanging at her side. "Wait," she said. Her voice was low, hard. Callum looked at her. She shook her head once. "Not like this," she said. "Not here." The cousin, wheezing through broken teeth, sneered. "Mercy, is it? Always was a soft little thing." Caroline smiled then, a small, terrible thing. "No," she said, "not mercy, judgment." She walked to the old well behind the barn. The stones were crumbling, moss-covered, the rope long rotted away. She picked up a loose rock, weighed it in her hand. "You buried enough of us in darkness," she said. "Time you know what that feels like." At her nod, Callum dragged the cousin across the yard, ignoring his curses and struggles. Together, they threw him into the black mouth of the well. The fall was long enough for his screams to echo once, twice, then vanish. Callum dropped the rock in after him. The final sound was a sharp, wet crack. Afterward, they burned the bodies of the others, piled them in the far field, set the fire high enough to send black smoke clawing at the sky. No one came to ask about it. Bitter Hollow had long since taught the surrounding country to look away. That night, Caroline sat by the fire, the rifle across her lap, her hands still. "You didn't have to come outside," Callum said from the shadows. She turned to him, face lit by the flames. "Yes, I did," she said. "This is my fight too." He nodded slowly. "You're not the girl they thought you were," he said. "No," she agreed, "I'm not." She went into labor 3 weeks later. It was a long night. The screams tore from her throat raw and unbidden. Callum stayed at her side, mopping her brow, his knuckles white from how hard he gripped her hand. When the child finally came, slick and screaming into the world, it was Callum who caught him. A boy small, furious, alive. Caroline collapsed back against the pillows, sweat-soaked and trembling. Callum laid the boy against her chest. She cradled him close, her tears silent, her heart breaking open and being remade all at once. Callum watched them, a hollow place inside him filling for the first time in years. He reached out, hesitant, and touched the baby's tiny hand. The boy curled his fingers around Callum's thumb with surprising strength. Caroline looked up at him, her face pale but fierce. "Name him," she whispered. Callum swallowed hard. "Samuel," he said, his voice cracked, "after my father." Caroline smiled, a real smile. And for the first time, Callum Hart believed in tomorrow. Not because it was promised, but because it was built, brick by stubborn brick, in the blood and fire and choosing. They had a family now. One made, not given. And it would be defended with every breath they had left. The seasons rolled forward, hard and unyielding. Bitter Hollow never gave blessings freely. Everything had to be earned. Samuel grew like a wild thing, barefoot and fearless, his dark hair always tangled, his laughter sharp against the hollow winds. Caroline taught him to read by lamplight, tracing the letters with his small fingers, while Callum showed him how to set traps, to sharpen a blade, to shoot straight and true. There was peace of a kind, a rough, jagged peace carved out of the land with bloodied hands. But peace is a fragile thing when the world has a long memory. It was near Samuel's 4th year when strangers came again, not drunks or debt collectors this time. These men rode under a sheriff's badge, their guns polished, their horses sleek and fed on stolen oats. They came at dawn, dust riding ahead of them like a herald. Callum saw them first from the ridge. He watched without moving, his heart sinking into that old cold pit it had not touched since the day he buried his first family. He knew before they even spoke that they hadn't come for justice. They came for what they thought was owed. The sheriff, big, red-faced, sweating in his wool coat, dismounted heavily. He tipped his hat to Callum in a show of false courtesy. "Morning, Hart," he said. "Got some questions for you." Callum stayed silent. The sheriff smiled thinly. "Seems there's a reward posted out east. Big money for a man named Callum Hart. Said he disappeared after putting 6 men in the ground. One of 'em the son of a wealthy landowner. Now, I don't much care what a man does to survive, but bounty's bounty." From the doorway, Caroline appeared. Samuel clutched against her skirts. Her face was calm, but her hands gripped the boy tight. Callum shifted his stance, putting himself between them and the lawmen. "You rode all this way," he said, voice low. "You best be sure you ain't riding back light." The sheriff's smile faltered. He lifted a hand, signaling the 2 deputies flanking him. "Be smart about it, Hart. You come quiet, we leave the girl and the boy alone." Callum laughed then, a cold, dead sound. "You think I built this life just to hand it over?" He leveled the rifle. "You think a piece of metal on your chest makes you a better man than me?" The sheriff's face darkened. "You'll hang, Hart," he said. "You and any fool who stands with you." At that, Caroline stepped forward. She reached into the folds of her skirt and drew a pistol, small but deadly. She aimed it steady, unwavering. "Then we all hang," she said. The standoff bled seconds into minutes. The deputies shifted nervously. One reached for his belt. Callum fired first. Chaos erupted. The first deputy went down, screaming, blood spurting between his fingers. Caroline fired next, catching the second in the leg. He crumpled to the ground, howling. The sheriff dove for cover behind the water trough, cursing. Bullets tore splinters from the porch pillars. Callum moved fast, ruthless. He dropped low, circling wide, using the smoke and dust as cover. He came up behind the sheriff, jammed the rifle into the man's side. "Drop it," Callum said. The sheriff froze, his gun half raised. He let it fall into the dirt. Caroline dragged Samuel back into the house, slamming the door, bolting it against whatever might come next. Callum forced the sheriff to his knees. "You came here thinking you were the hand of the law," Callum said, voice like iron. "But you're just another man trying to carve his piece out of someone else's back." The sheriff spat blood. "You'll never outrun it, Hart," he said. "Sooner or later the world catches up." Callum pressed the barrel against the base of the man's skull. "I ain't running," he said. He didn't pull the trigger. Instead, he stripped the sheriff of his weapons, his badge, his boots, left him bleeding and broken, tied to the half-burnt hitching post. He dragged the bodies of the dead deputies to the edge of the field and set them alight. No graves for men who came to take what wasn't theirs. When he finally came inside, Caroline was waiting. Samuel sat in her lap, clutching her hand, silent but watching, always watching. Callum knelt before them, stripped bare by everything he had done, everything he might yet have to do. "I should have told you," he said, "about what I was before, what I did." Caroline touched his face, tracing the scar along his jaw. "I knew," she said. "I always knew." And it broke something loose in him. The guilt, the rage, the grief. It came pouring out, not in words, but in the way he folded himself against them, the way he wrapped his arms around them as if he could shield them from the whole bloody world. Samuel, small and stubborn, wound his arms around his father's neck. For the first time in decades, Callum Hart wept. Not for the dead he had left behind, but for the living he could still save. In the morning, they packed what they could carry. They left Bitter Hollow behind, smoke still rising in thin trails across the valley. Ahead was nothing but unknown country, dangerous and vast. But they rode toward it together. Family forged by blood, betrayal, and the choice to fight for something better. And they would not be broken. They rode west into the unsettled hills, where the land rose in broken fists of stone and the rivers ran colder than blood. The world thinned there, Towns were few, and those that existed were stitched together with desperation and whiskey. They kept to themselves, living out of a canvas tent while Callum scouted for a place that could be theirs. Samuel grew lean and quick, his eyes sharp, his hands steady. He learned to catch fish with a thread of string and a bent nail, to move silent through the brush, to recognize danger not by its sound, but by the way the birds went still. Caroline carried the weight of their life on her back without complaint. She patched their clothes, cooked what little could be caught or gathered, taught Samuel to read the changing moods of the sky. Her belly grew round again by winter, another life forming in the slow, hidden way of seeds underground. They found it in late November. A hollow between two ridges, sheltered from the worst of the winds, the earth rich with the scent of pine and rain. An abandoned trapper's cabin stood at the center, half collapsed but repairable. A creak whispered nearby. "This," Callum said, dismounting stiffly, "this will do." They built it back into something living with their hands and their blood. Callum reforged the roof from felled cedar. Caroline lined the walls with woven mats to keep out the creeping cold. Samuel planted a garden, stubborn against the frost, pressing seeds deep and whispering promises over the dirt. When the snows came, they were ready. The days blurred into a rhythm of labor and firelight. Callum hunted elk in the high passes, his breath fogging in the thin air. Caroline crafted traps and dried meat against the hunger months. Samuel learned to whittle whistles and charms from bone, the music of them soft against the howling dark. And for a time, it was enough. Then spring brought a different kind of threat. A roving gang, armed and desperate, raided the small settlements east of the ridge. Word came on the wind, carried by a wounded trader who stumbled into their hollow half-dead from blood loss. "They're coming," he gasped, burning everything behind him. Callum knew there was no outrunning men like that. They smelled weakness. They followed it like wolves. That night he sat with Caroline by the fire. Samuel slept nearby, curled against the rough pelts. "We can run again," he said. His voice was ragged. "Or we can stand." Caroline met his gaze across the flames. "How long do you plan to keep running from the life you built?" she asked. He shook his head slowly. "I don't." "Then we stand," she said. It was not a grand speech. It was not a moment of banners and drums. It was a decision made in the marrow, unbreakable. Callum set to work. He dug pits along the entrance to the hollow, lined them with sharpened stakes. He showed Samuel how to load the old traps with jagged iron teeth. Caroline soaked rags in oil, winding them around arrows. When the riders came, they found not a huddled family, but a fortress of will. The first man through the pass screamed as the ground gave way beneath him. Others charged blindly, meeting fire and steel and the hard, unrelenting defense of people with nothing left to lose. Callum fought like the man he used to be, brutal and without hesitation. Samuel, perched in the rafters with his slingshot, knocked riders from their saddles with rocks hurled like bullets. Caroline, steady as the rising sun, fired arrow after arrow into the advancing shadows. The battle raged for hours. When the smoke cleared, the ground was littered with the bodies of those who thought they could take what had been earned with blood. Samuel wept when it was over, silent tears tracking the dirt on his face. Callum knelt beside him, pulled him close. "You did good, son," he said. "You did right." They buried the dead far from the creek, stacked stones over the shallow graves, left no markers. Some things were better forgotten. That night, Caroline went into labor. There was no midwife, no healer. Only the three of them, the walls close and the fire burning low. Hours dragged past, measured only by Caroline's cries and the desperate hope in Callum's heart. When the child came, it was a girl. Small, fierce, screaming her defiance into the cold world. Caroline, slick with sweat and blood, held her daughter against her chest and laughed, a sound torn between exhaustion and triumph. Samuel peered over the edge of the blanket, wide-eyed. "What's her name?" he whispered. Caroline looked up at Callum. "You choose," she said. Callum touched the tiny fist curled against Caroline's breast. "Hope," he said. His voice was a cracked whisper. "Her name is Hope." The days that followed were harder than any before. Food was tight. The wounds of the fight festered in their sleep, but they had a home, a family. Not the one Callum Hart had buried years ago. A new one, built in defiance of everything that had tried to destroy them. Callum watched Samuel teaching Hope to crawl, watched Caroline sewing patches into Samuel's worn trousers, watched the smoke from their chimney rise into the unbroken sky. He had offered Caroline a marriage of convenience once, nothing more than a shield against the cruelty of the world. She had given him a life reborn, a son who carried his strength, a daughter who carried his heart, a home where there had only been ruin, a family he had never dared to hope for again. And in that hard, silent land, scarred but still standing, Callum Hart finally understood what it meant to survive. Not just to endure, but to live. And this time he would not let it slip from his hands. Not for anything, not for anyone,